Serious. What was your creepy, unexplainable story as a child that was confirmed by your parents to have happened? Part 1. Please like and subscribe to support this channel. I live in Puerto Rico. If you have visited or at least gone to PR, you know there are a lot of abandoned houses. Where I live, there's one at the end of my street. I can sometimes see a man just staring at through a window and then disappear, and appear at another window. Sometimes I can see him on the roof of the house. The police came to check it out because a lot of people saw the same thing, and when they came they said no signs of somebody entering or leaving the residence. One weird thing they saw was a pair of running shoes being left at every window. I say it's weird not just because it's an abandoned house. The shoes were brand new, no signs of anyone wearing them. I can still see him at night. Sorry for the bad grammar, English is not my main language. So I don't actually remember this, but my mom told me about it. My grandfather died when I was a year old. Prior to his death, he loved to play with me and would make me laugh in this very specific way. The night he died, my mom heard me making noise. So she goes in assuming I'm crying, but I'm not. I'm staring at the ceiling, laughing hysterically just like my grandfather used to make me laugh. She's still convinced he came to say goodbye to me. I'm not 100% sure this fits because my mom confirmed it years ago, then denied it when I asked her again a couple months ago, but here it is. When I was little, my dresser, it was long but pretty short, sat against the wall with one of the ends pointed to my door. That dresser is heavy, an old wood one with all sorts of kid crap neatly arranged on top. Since it was in my bedroom, the floor was carpet. I always slept with the door closed. One night, with no explanation, the dresser tipped over. But instead falling forward, it fell 180 degrees to the side, falling in front of my door, all the kid crap spilling to the side. My mom ran to get me, but couldn't open the door as it was being blocked by the dresser. Eventually, with her pushing and me pulling on the dresser, she was able to slip in and move the dresser out of the way. Nothing was damaged, not even the glass figurines I had. My dad helped put it upright the next day and we moved on. Years later, I remembered the incident and asked my mom about it, expecting to learn that I blew it out of proportion and it only fell forward or something like that. Nope, she remembered that night as well. However, she added one detail that I could never figure out. She thought she heard me jumping on the bed that night, and that was why she thought the dresser tipped over. I had been asleep. I have no idea where she heard that noise coming from. In Mom's seaside hometown, there was an offshore decommissioned lighthouse. Even though utilities to it had long been shut off and the lighthouse was locked, it would randomly light up, clearly visible in all directions. No one could explain it. It happened so infrequently and at odd hours of the night that by the time officials examined the structure, there were no signs of activity. To this day, as I've mentioned here once before, the lighthouse remains mysterious and a bit creepy. When I was little, probably about 5, my great-grandmother passed away from cancer. We were very close. She watched me nearly every day and would sing to me before my naps. "You are my sunshine" in particular. It was a few days after she died and I can instinctively remember waking up to someone stroking my hair and singing "You are my sunshine." At first, I thought it was my mom, but it was unlike her to do something like that. I turned and found no one there. I even remember getting up and checking my parents' room to find they were both asleep. Both my parents kind of just nonchalantly dismiss it, but I swear it was her saying goodbye to me. When I was growing up, I lived in a small bungalow with my parents. My room was directly beside my parents' room. I had a fish tank with a light and used this as a sleep aid. The dim light of the tank and the bubbling sound of the filter put me at ease. One night I woke up and I saw the outline of a man wearing a trench coat and a top hat standing beside my bed looking at me. Naturally, I screamed as loud as I could and my parents came running into the room and turned the light on and the man was gone. They comforted me back to sleep and that's all I remember about that. Fast forward 3 to 4 years, I moved my room to the basement and my parents knocked down the wall to make their room bigger, but they keep their bed in the exact same place. Over the next year, I would wake up to screams from upstairs and hear my mom crying. She would always see outlines of a man standing in the exact place where I witnessed it before. They even moved their bed to attempt to put it where the figure would appear to stop it from appearing. It still scares me to this day thinking about that house and I'm glad I'm nowhere near there anymore. Alright man, here we go. This one really freaked me out and it is just crazy. So I grew up in Burton-upon-Trent. Now as a kid I always had a fascination with medieval era things, whether that be castles or knights. Now when I went to one castle, Tutbury Castle, I was having a good time up until we got to the gate when I felt a hand grip my shoulder with a harsh grip, then I screamed. My parents asked me what's wrong, but I noticed a weird expression on their face, so I thought they felt it too. We left very shortly after and I never went again. Soon after I felt like I was always being watched. I would look into the garden and see a figure twitching and I would always break down in my room. It got so bad that we had to move rooms. After a year of this thing chasing me, we moved to Basingstoke. After that I never felt chased or watched. My life as an adolescent was normal. About a decade ago I came back to my parents from the US and I told them what I remembered. They said that everything I saw they saw and just wouldn't tell me as they thought it would freak me out. We shared a good laugh about it, but it still makes my blood chill every time I think of it. At my parents' house I used to hear my mom calling out to me when she didn't, and she confirmed she'd hear me call out to her when I didn't. That was a common occurrence. Also, whenever I'd be alone for a little while, if my mom was late from work or at the grocery store, I'd usually be in the main living room playing N64. I would oftentimes hear loud banging sounds from upstairs as if a heavy piece of furniture tipped over. I'd go check and nothing was out of place. Both my mother and grandmother have confirmed similar experiences when they're alone in house. There was also the time I was downstairs on my laptop. Everyone else was in bed. It was after midnight and I didn't realize just how dark everything had gotten without the lights on. I'm zoned out when I begin to hear what sounds like a murmuring from behind me. Like the low rumble you'd hear at a gathering when people are talking and you can't make out conversation. The hairs on my neck immediately stood up and my body locked up from fear. Tears ran down my face from the physical reaction my body was having. I refused to acknowledge it and kept staring at my laptop screen in silence. It took forever for my body to go back to normal. Sometime later I told my mother what happened and it freaked her out because she said she's heard the murmuring as well. I've always hated that house. A neighbor across the hall from us had been murdered by her husband. I was only 6 or 7 at the time. I remember peeking through the keyhole and seeing her being brought out on the stretcher. I didn't know at the time she had died. I overheard my mother telling someone. I had the strangest dream, probably a night terror, where a man who looked like my dad, not a nice man, and a woman were walking through a maze with roses around them. She was frightened and I could hear her breathing getting louder and louder. I knew I shouldn't have been there. Her breathing was loud in my ear and then I woke up. It was scary and I had the same dream a few times until we moved. I talked to Mom a few years ago and asked what happened to the family. Apparently they moved soon after and everyone who lived there after asked to be transferred after a few months because of the strange panting sounds they heard and the nightmares kids had. My dad had actually stayed in the apartment after an argument a year or two after the lady passed. Another family moved and it was vacant, so he broke in I think, but likely the door was unlocked. He didn't last the night and Mom said he was almost pleading to be let in at 3 or 4 a.m. My mom said he stopped drinking for a while after that night and eased up on beating my mom a lot, but would never tell her why. The lady had been stabbed and died slowly. When my family went to the Georgian mountain region, we rented a cottage. 2 bedrooms, so my brother and I took one and our dad took the other with his GF. I woke up in the middle of the night to 3 figures in the room, all standing in various places, none of which were visible from the entrance of the room. I woke my brother up and we screamed for our dad. But when he came into the room, he refused to look at the figures and just told us to hide under the covers. Wasn't exactly confirmed, but his refusal to look where they were standing after begging him was telling. Shit still scares my brother and I. When I was a kid, my family lived in a blue house that was oddly shaped. One year the house got completed gutted and nearly destroyed by a flood and they had to knock down a wall between the living room and kitchen. So after the flood, you could see all the way down the hall to my parents' bedroom door. This house was strange asterisk for lack of a better term. I was a terrible sleeper as a kid and would routinely wake up and just go into the living room and watch cartoons on low volume if I couldn't go back to sleep. One morning I'm out in the living room sitting across the chair with my feet up on a window. Don't ask me why, I was a stupid 8 or 9-year-old. From where the chair was, I could see just over the kitchen counter down that hall to my parents' room. A movement caught my eye. I looked up and saw the shadowy outline of a man walking towards me, kind of near to my parents' door. Thinking it was my dad, I said something like, "Hey Dad, sorry if the TV was too loud." Dad is a notoriously light sleeper and would wake up from anything. Except there was no response. Within seconds my foot ends up going through the window. Again, not sure if this is related or I was a dumb kid. Likely the latter. And I scream, and my parents actually wake up to figure out what's going on at 4:30 in the morning. At this point I'm preoccupied, but realize much later that I definitely saw the outline of a man. But there was no way it was my dad because A, he came bounding out of their bedroom after my scream, and B, I realized the shoulders of that outline were much higher than what my dad's would have been. Fast forward to a few years ago, we've moved far away from the blue house, and my mom and I are hanging out and catching up. For some reason the blue house comes up and I tell mom that the place still gave me creeps and weird stuff happened there when I was a kid. Mom's response? Oh, you must have saw the shadow man too. I'm a parent of toddlers and kids now, and I have a creepy story from last year. We were driving with my then 3-year-old son in the car, and stopped at a red light next to a cemetery. Out of nowhere, my son looked over at the cemetery and said, "There are people laying down there, and they can't get up." My wife asked my son what he was talking about and he pointed to the cemetery and said, "All of the people laying down in the park are stuck." My wife and I just looked at each other in silence, completely freaked out. At this point in our son's life, there had been no deaths in the family and we had never discussed death with him. I'm still creeped out when I think about it. One time my brother, his friend, and I saw lights in the sky that darted around like UFOs. We went to get my mom and she was totally nonchalant about it. "Yep, those are UFOs," she said, and went back in the house. Her response was so subdued that we figured she was humoring us and they weren't actually UFOs. Years later I asked her about it and she said she had to force herself to act calmly because she was terrified. My mom said that I used to have premonitions when I was little, under the age of 10. My great aunt and great uncle were like grandparents to me and used to come visit in the summer from Mexico to the US. I would miss them terribly, then they would go. One year when they were leaving, I cried and cried. My mom said, "Don't worry. They'll be back next year." I remember sobbing and throwing a small child fit. Apparently I said to my mom, "No, you don't understand. Tio, great uncle, is never coming back." And she kept trying to reassure me they'd be back next year. I kept repeating, "He's never coming back." I didn't say anything about my great aunt. Sure enough, he passed away and never came back within a few weeks or months. My mom said it was really creepy and I also predicted my great aunt passing as well. When I was 9 or 10, my dad took me to visit with an older hunting buddy friend of his. My parents were divorced and my dad lived in another part of the country, so while I had known this guy since I was a toddler, I didn't share the same common interests as either of them. The older friend was a gun dealer and had lots of catalogs. This was before the internet was in wide use, to order bullets, magazines, guns, etc., and they often spent hours going through listings to determine what they wanted to order. We got there fairly early and my dad said that after an hour or two we'd all go to Hardee's for breakfast before going to shoot claybirds. Now I'm a youngin'. I don't care much about guns or hunting for sport and am just incredibly bored, so I start wandering around the house, reading my video game magazines that I brought with me, and very quickly that hour or two has passed and they're still down there. I ask if they're going to leave any time soon and the friend suggests I check the refrigerator in the kitchen and see if there's anything I want to eat. I look through the fridge and find nothing. However, on the kitchen table I see an apple and decide that will be appetizing enough to hold me over. As I pick up the apple and prepare to take a bite, at that point his wife steps in and tells me, "Don't eat that. Everything in the bowl is wax." I tell her thank you for warning me and continue to wander around the house burning time until we can get going. Maybe another 30 minutes later I go back to the basement where they're going through catalogs and ask when we are going to Hardee's. My dad's friend asks if I'm still hungry after going through their fridge. I tell him that I was going to eat an apple, but his wife told me it was wax before I made the mistake. Both of them give me a blank stare, and after about 20 seconds of shock my dad explains that his wife recently passed away. I then go back through the house to try to find her to show that they were just joking with me, but sure enough she was nowhere to be found. Roughly 30 years later, before he passed away, my dad still insisted that I must have imagined it. But I didn't. She told me not to eat the wax fruit. I was in 7th grade when my parents bought their first computer, so not super young. We had a small ranch, so my dad built a corner desk in the basement in one of the finished-off rooms since there was no room anywhere else. House was built by my dad in the mid-80s. No one had lived there before us. When my mom would get home from work, we'd hear her set down her keys on the counter and walk across the kitchen floor in her heels. It was a frequent occurrence for my brother or I to be on the computer, Happened to each of us quite a bit. And hear sounds of my mom putting her keys on the counter and walking across the kitchen floor, same as when she gets home from work. In going upstairs to check to see if my mom was home, she wouldn't be home. We would tell my mom when it happened, and it happened enough where we tried to figure it out by checking the time we'd hear it. A few times, she said she'd been thinking about work at that time and happened to look at the clock. We tried to figure it out and have no idea to this day why it would continuously happen. A few times my mom mentioned she'd be on the computer and hear someone upstairs, and no one would be home. My dad didn't allow pets in the house either, so it wasn't just a cat being a jerk. Not so much creepy as unexplainable. I have a memory of standing in my grandmother's suburban backyard with my cousin. We were maybe 3 to 4 years old, watching a line of penguins in a neighboring yard climb up a pool slide and slide down into a pool, one by one. They would swim to the stairs, waddle out of the pool and around the pool back to the slide stairs and wait in line to go down the slide again. I never mentioned the memory and assumed, because it was so implausible, that I dreamt it up or remembered wrong. A couple decades later, I visited my grandmother and this same cousin was also visiting. We were sitting at my grandma's kitchen table which looked out at her backyard. There was a lull in the conversation, and we were all looking out the window. It made me think of the whole penguin memory, so I brought it up. My cousin's eyes widened and she said she had the same memory, but, like me, thought it was a dream. My grandma chuckled and said, "Well, the neighbor that used to live there did work for the zoo." Not exactly a confirmation, but, did that really happen? Even if he did work for the zoo, you can't just bring a dozen penguins home, can you? When I was a small kid, I had a bad night where it sounded like someone was in my room. The grunting was later identified as my mom snoring, but one thing in particular that stood out was that it sounded like my neighbor was talking, only he was in another country at the moment. I also would see apparitions of a man walking around at night, and when I was a bit older, my mom was like, "Oh, that must have been your great-great-uncle. He still walks around to check on the family." Surprisingly though, I wasn't creeped out. Was looking for a Halloween costume with my mom to wear to elementary school, which was a big deal to me because I was homeschooled at first. We spent a couple of hours going to several stores and couldn't find anything that I liked. It was getting dark outside, so we were going to have to find something and go home soon. There was an old Halloween costume store, one of those really weird places that somehow is open year-round, that we decide to go to as a last-ditch effort to find something. We got out of the car and walked through the front doors and get 3 steps into this place and I instantly have all the hair on my body stand on end. I felt huge oppressive pressure on my whole body, like the physical feeling of being hated by something, combined with it wanting to hurt me and wanting me to leave. My little 3rd grade, I think that's when it happened, self turned to look at my mom and in the same instant she turned to look at me. We didn't say a thing to each other, just turned around, after only walking 3 steps into the store and went back to the car. I remember getting inside and asking my mom if she felt the same thing and she said that she had had essentially the same experience as me. We prayed together in the car and left. For perspective, I as an elementary school kid who desperately wanted to fit in with the other kids that I had recently joined in public school, willingly left our literal last chance to find a costume that I thought would help me fit in, because of a physical feeling of being hated that I got when we walked into the store. As an adult I can still remember how bad it was and am getting tensed up just writing about it. I did end up with a costume that year though. We went home and she stayed up late with me working to cobble together a cowboy costume from things we had at home. I had a cowboy hat from my grandpa, some cowboy boots from somewhere, a button-down shirt that we ripped a bit to make it rugged, a bright red bandana to tie around my neck, and a swanky, leather vest we made from a brown grocery bag that we cut some super cool tassel fringe onto. About 5 years ago my parents were sitting out on the back porch on a summer night. Out of the corner of her eye my mom saw a person-sized white translucent figure float by a tree. She asked my dad if he saw it too and he said yes. He is a tough guy but he was really freaked out and so was she, so they both went inside. The next morning my mom was walking by the tree where they saw the figure and she noticed a very old-looking earring sitting on top of the dirt. She doesn't wear earrings and it wasn't the kind of earring I would wear. It looked like it belonged to an old lady and it was just dropped there. My mom brought it inside and put it in her jewelry box. The next day it was sitting in the middle of the basement floor. From then on I started hearing footsteps and whispering in my room at least once a week until I moved out. This was in the 70s and it was when I was young enough to still believe in Santa. I think I was 5. We lived out in the country. We never locked our doors and it was summer, so not only was the door unlocked but all the windows were wide open. So gaining entry to our home was really easy. So it was the middle of the night and Mom hears a noise. Wakes up my dad and Dad said it's nothing. A few minutes later my mom goes, "Did you hear that?" Nope, Dad still didn't hear anything. Then banjo music from our living room. My mom says, "Surely you hear that." By then I hear the music in my room. I come out of my room as my parents come out of theirs. My mom or dad tuned on the living room light. I see an old man with white hair and a beard playing a banjo. He was wearing a hat and brown jacket. He was sitting on the chair where our Christmas tree always was set up at wintertime. That chair got shoved into storage at Christmas, so it was smack dab where the tree would have been if it was Christmas. Somehow all that put together in my little 5-year-old little girl mind, this was obviously Santa doing a summertime visit. I yelled, "Santa!" Ran towards him, my mom yelled no. I stopped, she took me to my room. This part 1 was told much later. My dad asked the man what he was doing in our house. He was a lost, tired hobo. He called himself a hobo. He was hoping for a nice place to rest. He thought no one was home. Not sure why. Yeah, the house was dark, but cars were parked outside. My dad said to him, "My daughter thinks you're Santa. So I want you to empty your pockets. Show me you have no weapons. Then sit there. I am going to call my daughter out and you're going to ho and ask her if she's been good girl. Then my wife will make you something to eat and I will drive you to the Greyhound station and give you enough money to get a few towns away. Understand?" He said that he did and that he had a knife in his bag but had no intentions to ever use it as a weapon. And agreed to my dad's terms. My dad yelled for me and my mom. And I went and hung out with Santa. He played and sung a few Christmas songs and an Elvis song strangely. I was awed by the banjo and asked for one for Christmas. He said maybe, then pulled a harmonica out of his pocket and gave it to me. My mother swiftly confiscated it. Hobo spit EU. Santa sent me off to bed. My mom fed him, my dad gave him a decent bit of money, I guess. My mom gave him some deer jerky and some other food for his bag. And my dad drove him to the nearest Greyhound station. Years later I was looking back on that with nostalgia. I thought my parents hired someone to play Santa at summer because it was a bad summer, I was having health issues. So I mentioned it to my mom as a teen. She said, "Yeah, that still creeps me out." I asked what she meant. She told me the true story of that night. But as much as it sounds scary, I can't help remembering it as what my 5-year-old brain thought it was. I think back on it as a cool thing that happened. My granny died when I was little. I don't even remember her. My aunt and mom always told me this story. I was at my house when I was little, I think about 4. The phone rang and I answered it. They got on to me for answering the phone. I told them it was my granny calling to see if I was okay. I told her yes and hung up. She had recently passed away. They said they were a little creeped out by it, but insisted it really happened. TLDR. When I was about 30, I was going through boxes of family heirlooms and found a photograph of the ghost I used to see as a child. When I turned it over, the name matched that of my ghost. See photos. Asterisk. When I asked my dad, he remembered her and got freaked out all over again. She had been a real person, and the things I'd said about her were true. Basically, when my great aunt died, my dad inherited a bunch of antiques and family heirlooms. Along with it came a bunch of creepy portraits, one of which I swore was haunted. I called her Aunt Jane, and she was a nice ghost. I was about 12 at the time, which is kind of too old for made-up ghosts. No one really knew how to deal with the situation, myself included. When Aunt Jane arrived, she asked if I would find the photo of her when she was younger and display it somewhere because she thought she looked too old in the big portrait. My dad probably thought I was being silly, but I was pretty insistent, so he humored me. We briefly looked for the photo that she wanted, but we didn't find it. Instead I settled on another portrait of her. It wasn't the right one, but I wasn't allowed to mess with the antiques without permission, so I gave up the search and up into the attic they went. 20 years later, I visited my parents and felt compelled to go up into the attic. I found the boxes of heirlooms and something in my brain said, "You need to take these home with you." Today, I lived in an apartment and didn't have the space, but something compelled me. I asked Dad if I could take the photographs and digitize them, and he agreed. Not long afterwards, I forget the actual time span, but less than a year, a tornado hit my parents' house and tore off the roof, leaving the attic exposed to the elements. I thought to myself, oh man, I'm really glad I took those photos. But didn't consider it to be anything other than luck, intuition. Maybe halfway through scanning photos, there she was. I can't even begin to describe the load of emotions I felt when I saw her face. Here was the photo that Auntie Jane's ghost had requested. I thought to myself, surely I must be crazy. It's probably just because it's a lady from a similar time period, so their hairstyles match. And then I turned it over to read the name on the back 0. Later that day, I called my dad and asked him if he remembered Auntie's ghost. He said that he did, and that the portrait was still right where we'd left it. I had him send me a photo, and though the back of his is not labeled since it's basically a giant pinback button, we both think it's the same person. What do you think? When I was 3 years old, my grandmother died. She lived in our house with us and we were very close. She had told my mom many times that she would do her best to make her passing easy on me since I was so young. The night that she died, my mom was laying in bed with her and heard her take her last breath. My mom laid there and cried for about 30 minutes before coming into my room to check on me. It was about 5 a.m. and there was no reason for me to be awake, but I was sitting up in my crib playing, and when my mom asked why I was awake, I said, "Grandma Flo just came in to give me a kiss goodbye." When I was young, I apparently had a few odd interactions with animals. I would know a person had animals before we went in the house. They tended to come over to me before my parents, mostly just little things that were probably explainable by me, a fairly observant little kid. The one that sticks out to my parents though, telling it the way they do, is we went to a new car garage to have them work on our car. As we pull up, the owner has a big old black lab laying in the middle of the lobby. The guy informs us the dog is comfortable with people, we can pet him if we want. I shake my head and say, "He's sad though." Dad looks at me, asks why I think that. I reply, "He lost his ball, he's sad now." Dad said the owner went pale, stared at me for a minute, and then looked at Dad, said, "He's had a favorite ball for 10 years that just went down the sewage drain yesterday and I couldn't get it back out." I woke up one night when I was 12 because I dreamt that my older brother got into a car accident. I got out of bed and wandered downstairs to the kitchen to get something to drink. My mother was sitting there and asking me why I was awake. I told her, had a bad dream and need something to drink. I got a glass of water when it ringed at our door. My mother went to look who was there in the middle of the night. 2 police officers that asked if they could come inside for a moment. I couldn't hear what they were talking about because I was still in the kitchen and they were in the hallway. After the 2 officers left, my mother came back to the kitchen completely pale and told me that I should go to bed now. I asked her what's wrong when she informed me that my brother was in a car accident and she needs to wake up my dad and go to the hospital now. When I pointed out that this was the bad dream I had before waking up, she only looked at me for a couple of seconds. I prepared myself for comments like, "Don't be silly and go to bed now," but instead she said, "Me too, so basically. We both had the same fucking dream of my brother having a car accident. And we both woke up minutes before the police came over to tell us it really happened." My brother survived with some minor injuries and we've seen the photos of the accident in the newspaper the next day. It looked 100% like in my dream. To the smallest detail. The way he lost control over the car, where it flipped the first time and the tree it came to a stop. Even today my mother and I talk about this. Nobody else believes us when we tell the story. This story is my older cousin's and I'm sure he doesn't remember, so I'm not sure it counts. My grandpa passed away. Neither me or my sister got to meet him. The last cousin to have met him was my cousin I'll call Jay. Jay was apparently 1 to 2 years old and he was grandpa's favorite. The following week from when he had died, my family was creeped out by whenever Jay would call out, "No," what he called grandpa, and start talking to him. One time while his babysitter was taking care of him, he started calling out "No" again, and the dogs even started barking when even at passerbys they wouldn't. She got scared apparently and said something along the lines of, "Motherfucker. Don't haunt me, sir, please." Other family members would start talking to grandpa whenever Jay said no, begging him to leave since apparently he was this really funny guy who liked to scare people, and told my mom and her siblings he would haunt them for fun. My grandmother was a real estate agent in Rhode Island. I was staying with her one summer and she had to take me along to see a potential listing. It was a very strange house because it was circular. All the rooms went along the outside and connected to each other, and there was a center part with a little garden and open to the sky. She went up to the 2nd story and I stayed downstairs because I wanted to walk around the loop one time. The problem started when I had walked a full loop and I didn't see the stairs. I thought I must be confused, so I kept going to the next room and still couldn't find them. I started to panic, so I began running around the house as fast as possible, checking every room for stairs, and there wasn't any. Finally, I sat down by the front door and started crying. A little while later, my grandmother ran into the entryway room looking just as panicked as I had been and asking where I was hiding and why I was hiding and not answering her calling out to me. I never heard her calling out to me at all. Actually, the house seemed so still and quiet while I was sitting there that I was sure she had forgotten and left me there. We went home and didn't talk about it really. Like 15 years later, I brought it up to my mom and asked if she knew anything or was this a crazy childhood nightmare I'm remembering. She told me she remembered it clearly because my grandmother had called her and was absolutely spooked because she couldn't explain what had happened and she thought she lost me or I had been taken by someone while she was distracted. She had apparently been looking for me for a while. I still don't understand what happened really because the house wasn't even large or confusing to navigate. I still get chills when I think about it. When I was 10 years old, I often visited a friend who lived around 4 miles away from me. To get there, I had to walk next to a huge cornfield with only a couple of houses on the side of it. After spending some time at his house, I had to walk back home. The street I walked on was mostly empty and there was rarely anyone walking their dog or jogging there, so I was alone on it with no one around most of the time. The houses were always empty and looked like people simply left them behind and nobody new moved in, with windows barricaded and doors always shut. One day I walked back home and my shoelace came loose. I bent over to tie it. All of a sudden I see a shadow reaching over me. I quickly look behind me and see an old lady with short black hair with the scariest smile behind me reaching for my shoulder, only a few inches away from me. I immediately started to run for my life, only turning around one more time to see her still standing there and still staring at me with her evil smile. I ran all the way to my house and broke down crying when I got home. My parents told me that nobody lives in those houses. I walked by the house a few more times over the last 11 years but have never seen anyone near that house ever again, and it is still empty. I get shivers writing this story. One day my parents and my sister all went to bed early, at around 7-8ish. We were all incredibly light sleepers. We woke up at the tiniest noise and the floorboards downstairs were creaky as shit. Anyway, we woke up the next morning to find a messy as fuck house. Like the footstool was tipped over. All the contents inside of it was hollow, had come out. The kitchen was a mess. The toys in my bedroom were all out. My parents' clothes, washing, etc. were just splayed everywhere. There was nothing in the house that had remained untouched, not even our air hockey table. I lost my Sonic Xbox 360. The shoelace. I woke up one morning and the shoelace from one of my sneakers had completely vanished. Just on one shoe. The lace on the other shoe was still there. I do not ever remove the laces of my shoes. The shoes were right beside me by my bed all night. I have always been a ridiculously light sleeper. The slightest sound wakes me up. Nothing woke me that night. Moreover, the door was closed to my room. The floorboards creaked whenever anyone stepped on them, and the room was small. I 100% would have noticed someone coming in. Nothing else was disturbed in the entire house. Nothing had been moved or taken, no signs of forced entry. My mum noticed nothing all night. She also has no sense of humor. There was nobody in the house aside from me and her, and nobody but us had the keys. We didn't have mice, and there were no traces of the missing lace anyway. There is absolutely no way that shoelace could have gone missing. My mum remembers it well, but as soon as I mention it she immediately doesn't want to talk about it because it freaks her out. Either somebody broke into the house and did nothing except take a single shoelace, or the house was haunted and a ghost took it. Not necessarily creepy, but when I was around 11 or so, my mom and I were going about 40 miles outside of town for a typical orthodontist appointment. The trip typically took about 35 minutes give or take a few for traffic. However, this one time I kinda zoned out while being driven, and upon arriving we remarked, "Wow, that was fast." We were earlier for my appointment than usual despite leaving at a consistent time for each appointment. Upon looking at our vehicle's clock, and confirming with a watch my mom had on, it had mysteriously taken us only 10 minutes to drive the usual 35-minute distance. We have no recollection of anything happening during those 10 minutes, and it never happened again, but it left us with a very weird feeling. We still wonder what we drove through to this day. This is sort of embarrassing. My mom got an IUD after my sister and I were born. 4 years after my sister, a random priest stopped her in the streets and told her, "Why are you stopping Goddess Durga's will? She wants to gift you a son." My mom was understandably freaked out. It's not like my family didn't want a son, because trust me, Asian obsession with sons is real. It's just that they didn't want another daughter, so they weren't trying. Anyways, a few days later we had a kirtan asterisk, sort of like a musical prayer meeting, and one of the ladies there got possessed by goddess asterisk Mata Anna as Indians call it. Sort of like a trance possession, and the person possessed starts spewing all sorts of things that make sense but don't. Super creepy, scary shit. So, that woman, a stranger, straight up looked at mom and handed her an apple. Said, "Eat it and get that foreign thing out. I want to give you a son. How dare you deny me of my wish?" Word spread like fire about this incident. Suddenly half the town was interested in my parents' marital life. Small town, mom didn't budge then though. My parents met another priest who they considered their teacher. He said that they should try and let what's meant to be happen. Well, I had a brother within a year. Most exciting 9 months for our town since we didn't know the gender. Gender testing is illegal in India to prevent female feticide. Might be too late to the party, but sometimes I think about this. My mom and I were driving back from my grandmother's house in Chicago around dusk. While we were on one of the side streets in a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, suddenly the lights in the car turned on and harmoniously got incredibly loud. I didn't know lights could make sound like this. They reached a boiling point and the whole car turned off. We looked outside and all the streetlights surrounding the car had blown out as well. The stoplight in front of us and a little ways away were blinking as if the power had gone out. We were the only car in the area at the time. My mom turned the car back on and we drove away with no explanation. About 15 minutes on the highway and the whole car just turns off. We were able to pull over to the side of the road safely and it turned back on with no issues after that. I googled events similar to this around the time but never came up with any answers or any other reports of this type of thing. Still don't know what caused it to this day. I was very young when this happened, so what I remember and what I was told is the main scariness for this story. So my family was driving around the backwoods on NHME area in the autumn to watch the leaves fall. We were staying at some cottage and my family came to this area pretty frequently. We were coming back from somewhere when my mother started screaming at my father for stopping abruptly. In front of us, on an unkept back road in the deep woods of New England at a pretty late hour, was a traffic jam of quite a few cars stopped in all directions. I remember a lot of bright headlights. I also remember seeing my dad's face as he turned around so he could see where he was reversing the car. My mom went completely silent through this whole thing. I just remember my dad saying eerily calmly, I hate traffic. And #X200B. He turned around and started driving back up the road we came down and we started seeing cars going past us flashing their headlights. My dad just kept driving. The whole atmosphere went from, "Wasn't that a fun day?" to, "Let's leave." Even as a kid I went from annoying to quiet. Just a thickness in the air. Cars started coming up from behind honking and flashing lights and eventually they just turned off the road and we drove back to the cottage. And #X200B. And #X200B. Years later, I mean decades later, my dad and me were having a beer together. He says, "Remember up in the woods up north? We were driving around and we came to a weird traffic jam?" I was like, "Yeah. Why?" I honestly hadn't thought of it since that night. My dad goes, "Well, your mother and I were pretty sure that was one of those ambushes where they block the road and try to rob you and leave you in the woods or worse. You don't remember the cars coming up the road after us, trying to block us in? Or the cars chasing us and beeping at us until we hit random route?" Well, kinda, but I just figured it was traffic or people being weird. He just kinda stopped talking about it after that and went on about how we should plant more trees in the backyard, but ones that don't drop leaves, because leaves suck. When I was a kid, my mom used to work at a small grocery store and she went there before breakfast to get fresh bakery goods when she had the afternoon shift. Then she used to wake me up for school, and ask how I slept, and I used to tell her what dream I had that night, if any. One morning I told her I dreamed that 2 guys broke into the store and they left a red screwdriver on the floor. My mom was shocked, because there really was a break-in that night. That is why she couldn't buy stuff for breakfast that morning, but couldn't talk with police or colleges at the time to get more details. I then went to school. My mom did the afternoon shift and on the evening, when she came home, she told me that the police really did found a screwdriver on the scene, which belonged to the burglar. This all happened in Europe, a small town around the early 90s, no CCTV and the burglars never got caught, but this was still a very strange experience. My mom made me fill out a lottery ticket the next day, lol, but never won with it and never had such dreams since then.